So everyone look at that for just a second. Which of these two versions of the Supreme Court does Hamilton see? What does he see when he envisions the Supreme Court? Caitlin, why would you argue before? What in this wording makes you see the first?
So I think that he thinks it's the before courtroom because he's describing it as if it really doesn't have a backbone and it doesn't have a whole lot of force. And he says it depends on the executive branch to execute judgments and everything. He just describes it as being pretty weak and relatively unimportant.
Yeah, so the anti-federalists were concerned. They're like, this federal court's going to overrun our states. The federal court's going to take away states' rights. It's going to judge against the states. Alexander Hamilton said, don't worry about it. This court doesn't have force nor will. All it is judgment. And it even has to depend on the executive branch to carry out what it says. Don't worry about a Supreme Court. Not going to be powerful. So another way of showing this, before the implementation of judicial review, the Supreme Court looked something like this. After, the Supreme Court looked a little more like this. Now the question is that a good thing? If that ferocious fighting bunny rabbit is coming after you, that's probably really scary. But if that's your guard dog, maybe that's a good thing. Now I was tempted to Photoshop the head of the second bunny onto the face of Chief Justice John Roberts to really drive home the point that this is like our current Supreme Court, but I figured that might be something a high school student would do, but probably a high school teacher shouldn't do, so you can just kind of leave that to the imagination. But that's the power that the modern Supreme Court has. In the next few minutes, I want to talk about the case that gave the Supreme Court that power, and then let's look at some cases on how that's been applied. And as we do this, I'll invite you to think on that question, is this good? Is this a good system to have the Supreme Court have as much power as it is? We'll look at some really good things that they've been able to do with that power, some really bad things, and start to explore this question of what should the Supreme Court's power look like. Okay, so judicial review started with a case called Marbury versus Madison. Oh wait, sorry, wrong Marbury. William Marbury, not Stephen Marbury. Okay, so Marbury versus Madison in a case which had everything and yet nothing to do with something called a writ of mandamus. Writ of mandamus. Okay, once upon a time, John Adams was president, and he had his secretary, John Marshall. After John Adams didn't get elected a second term, he wrote a bunch of appointments. So imagine President Obama right now writing a bunch of appointments to be handed out before Donald Trump takes office, because he's like, hey, I want my political people in office, not Trump's political people in office. So he starts filling out all of these different letters certifying that different people have jobs. One of those people is William Marbury, who is going to be Justice of the Peace. He was really excited because this was a big pay raise for him, a big step up, a promotion. One problem, John Marshall and all of the things that he was trying to do before their time was up in office didn't deliver all of those, didn't deliver all of the commissions. But he said, no problem. James Madison, who is the new Secretary of State, and Thomas Jefferson, who is the new president, they'll deliver these because they've already been approved by Congress, they've been signed by the president, they just need to be sent out. Well, Thomas Jefferson kind of pulled the high school teacher. Have you ever had a high school teacher, you turn in an assignment late and you're like, hey, I completed the assignment, I just didn't submit it on time. And the high school teacher was like, it's not complete until it's submitted. Have you ever had a high school teacher do that? I imagine Jefferson doing that exact same thing. The commission's not complete until it's submitted. So he said, no, you don't get your commission. And William Marbury's upset. He's like, hey, I want that commission. And then he had an idea. He's like, you know what? The very first year It's like 11 years ago, the very first year that the Constitution was in effect, 1789, the legislative branch wrote a Judiciary Act of 1789, where they gave the Supreme Court the power to issue a writ of mandamus. And a writ of mandamus says to the other branches, hey, you executive branch, I order you to do this. Or, hey, legislative branch, I order you not to do this. Give a green check mark if you said that would increase the power of the judicial branch. Would that make the judicial branch more powerful to have the ability to issue writs of mandamus? A case could go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court could say, you know what, executive branch, you need to do that. You know what, judicial branch, you need to do that. It would make the Supreme Court more powerful. So this case goes to the Supreme Court. Marbury says, hey, Supreme Court, use the writs of mandamus that we gave you in 1789 to force Madison to give me my commission. Now, John Marshall's in a tricky spot because John Marshall is the Chief Justice, but he's also the person that failed to give Marbury his commission. Currently, he probably wouldn't be allowed to judge in this case because of conflict of interest because he was so involved in the proceedings, but at this time they didn't really practice that. So he wrote the decision even though he was so intimately involved. He does this in a really interesting way, which is fascinating, okay? So maybe I'll describe it and then we'll talk about why this is so crazy what he does. So first, he says there's 3 questions of the case. The first one is the one that Marbury's asking, but the second 2 are the ones that you need to ask in order to answer the first one. So 1, did Marbury have the right to the commission, right? That's Marbury's argument. I have a right to this commission. You, Supreme Court, issue a writ of mandamus. Second, do the laws of the country give Marbury a legal remedy? If Marbury feels like he's been wronged, is there a legal way to fix that problem? Third question is asking the Supreme Court for a writ of mandamus the correct legal remedy. Okay, do you see how these build upon each other? Marbury's asking this question, but Marshall's saying, you know what, to answer that, you need to go through this logical process. So he says, did Marbury have a right to the commission? Yes, he did. Which is really important for Marshall to say that. Why? Because he's the one that was supposed to be delivering that commission. Can you imagine if he said no? Kind of the slap to his own face he would give, be like, yeah, he didn't really have a right to that commission. He had to be true to John Adams. He had to be true to his party. So he's like, yeah, you did have a right to it. Do the laws of the country give Marbury a legal remedy? Yes, Marshall argues. He says, if you have a legal right to something, you have to have a legal right to resolve a problem. So if Liz has a legal right to her chair, her nice comfy brown chair, she has to have the legal right to remedy if someone steals that, right? It wouldn't, if you said you have the right to a chair but you don't have a legal remedy if someone steals it from you, then you don't really have that right. Third, is asking the Supreme Court for writ of mandamus the correct legal remedy? Marshall says no. Why? Because the legislative branch didn't have the power in 1789 to give the Supreme Court power to issue a writ of mandamus. So question, did that decision make the Supreme Court more powerful or less powerful? Green check mark if you say more, red X if you say less. So it says legislative branch, you didn't have the power to give us the writ of mandamus. Did that make the Supreme Court more powerful or less powerful? Okay, Harrison, why do you say less? Sally, why do you say more?
I think less, because the Supreme Court went to the legislative branch and said, you don't have the right to give us the right of the Marbury. And so basically by saying that they remove all times they can ever use that again, even though it was issued a year before. And so for them to ever use that again, it would have to go through the president, and then the legislative branch would have to issue it. The president would have to look it over, then he'd have to approve, and then you'd have to, go through the huge long checklist in order to get it approved before the Supreme Court could ever use it again.
Okay, so in essence, the legislative branch gave the judicial branch a handgun, right? They gave them a gun. They're like, you have the right to use this handgun. Marshall saying, you didn't have the right to give us that handgun. Here's the handgun back. We're not going to use it. Sally, why do you argue that it actually gave them more power?
Well, I would say it gave them more power because probably eventually someone would be like, oh, that wasn't correct, and they take it away. And what could the Supreme Court say? They're not just legislative. But by him doing this, all of a sudden now, when they rule on Obamacare and things like that, people are like, oh, that's the law. Even though they don't make the laws, they're not necessarily supposed to check the laws. They don't veto, they don't override veto, they don't do any of that stuff. But somehow, suddenly now they have this power to check the balances of the government.
Okay, good point, Sally. Did you guys hear what Sally said? The Supreme Court ruled that an entire action of the legislative branch was unconstitutional. That the legislative branch didn't get to determine what the powers were of the Supreme Court. So while the Supreme Court took this handgun of power and said, no, we don't want the writ of mandamus, we want to be able to determine what our own powers are. We decide that our powers are like a machine gun. We can declare an act unconstitutional. So do you see how in this answer, Marshall, while he says on the top, he's like, you know what, we don't have the power to issue a writ of mandamus. We're not that power. Really what he's doing is he's giving more power to the legislative judicial branch than ever before. Exactly, Caitlin. He's saying, legislative branch, you aren't our boss. We're our own boss. We get to determine what's constitutional or not. This was the first time in history that the Supreme Court categorically said something's unconstitutional. So what did this mean? It meant in future court cases, the Supreme Court could decide that again. Dred Scott versus Sanford. The Supreme Court could decide that certain state laws were unconstitutional, that certain national laws, the Compromise of 1820, was unconstitutional, that Dred Scott wasn't even a human and couldn't bring a court case to the Supreme Court because according to the Constitution, he only counted as 3/5 of the person. But on the other hand, you have cases like Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court uses that same power to end segregation and to start unifying people. Or you have really controversial cases like Roe v. Wade, where many Americans are so grateful that the Supreme Court ruled that way so that they have protected their right for abortion. Many other Americans are so upset that the Supreme Court ruled this way because they say that the child has a right to life, and that trumps the right of the mother over, whether to have an abortion or not. So this court case, the Supreme Court has a ton of power. Some people are really happy with that power. Some people are disappointed. Some people are happy with that power when it goes the way they want it to, but they don't like it when that power is used the other way. We have a big question here in America. Does the Supreme Court's power, is it too much? Or is it good? Is it good that the Supreme Court has that much power to keep the other branches in check?